Good afternoon and welcome to the Committee for Workers International CWI Media broadcast. Today we're going to be looking and discussing at a crucial aspect of the global struggle for socialism, and that is the legacy of one of the greatest revolutionaries in history, Leon Trotsky. Today, as we're broadcasting, is the anniversary of the assassination of Trotsky in 1940 on the 20th of August by a Stalinist agent who was sent to Mexico to persecute and finally carry out his execution. They thought and they hoped that by killing Trotsky they would succeed in killing his ideas. In that, however, they have manifestly failed. But it's necessary, I think, for us today in the Committee for Workers International to look at the role of Trotsky, but also the legacy of his commitment to the revolution and the relevance of his crucial ideas to today's situation and the struggle for global socialism. Trotsky was assassinated, as I say, in 1940. If they thought they killed his ideas, they manifestly failed. But in killing him, I think we need to underline the role that Trotsky had played both in the struggle of the working class in Russia and indeed internationally, but also the commitment he demonstrated to that particular struggle. Trotsky did not really lead one life. He led the life of many, many individuals in terms of his commitment and what he achieved during his lifetime. He began his political activity in 1896, an incredible feat as a young man, going into activity, drawn into Russian socialist circles, and very quickly was driven into exile by the vicious Tsarist regime which existed in Russia at that particular time. And in fact, that wasn't his only exile. There was 2 exiles in Siberia and a series of other exiles throughout his life. He escaped twice from Siberia, heroically traveling over the snow-capped peaks, etc., in order to escape and participate in the revolutionary movement. He was active in the 1905 revolution. Not just active, he was elected as the president of the first Soviet, the Workers' Council, which was set up during the course of that revolutionary movement. And there we saw one of his most important contributions politically, where he outlined the ideas of the theory of the permanent revolution, which defined very clearly the class character of the revolution in Russia, which has many concrete and practical applications to the struggles of the neo-colonial world today. Again, following the defeat of the 1905 revolution, he was driven into prison. He was again subject to exile, participated in debates, not always in agreement with Lenin on the question of at that stage of the character of the party in 1903. And again found himself later in life in exile. And at the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, he found himself in exile in the United States, returning back to Russia, imprisoned by the British in Canada on his way in a concentration camp for a period, but nevertheless returned to Russia, became in July a leader of the Bolshevik Party, was active throughout the whole of the revolution itself, and crucially, as a leader and being at one politically with Lenin at that stage, played the crucial role in organizing the insurrection during the revolution in October itself. And that in and of itself would have been an historical feat. But that was not all of Trotsky's contribution. As the revolution was isolated, it was threatened with 21 foreign armies of the imperialist powers who tried to intervene to crush it. We saw the Civil War, which unfolded immediately after the revolution as well, and Trotsky from nothing built up the Red Army into a fighting machine which was able to repel and to defeat the imperialist powers and secure a victory for the revolution itself. And of course, at that particular stage, it's a measure of Trotsky's genius, of what he did during the course of the revolution, during the course of the Civil War, the development of his military ideas. And he hadn't studied military questions prior to being thrust into the leadership of the Red Army. His works on military affairs are still studied to this day in the capitalist military academies. Such a contribution was made by him on that particular questions. And then, of course, we saw the death of Lenin in 1924. We saw the political defeat of the revolution. As we saw, it was isolated to Russia. It did not spread, which has been the original idea of the Bolsheviks, to spread the revolution beyond Russia, internationally, particularly into Germany and other advanced capitalist countries in Europe. That did not take place at that time, and it led to the development of a bureaucratic clique, a Stalinist clique around Stalin. And it was Trotsky himself that led the left opposition and fought against this Stalinist regime, which abandoned the idea of the world revolution, adopted the idea of a reactionary idea of socialism in one country. So we saw Trotsky playing this incredible role. And by the way, that is one of the reasons the capitalists today absolutely hate Trotskyism and the Trotskyists, because they cannot put the same label over the Trotskyists as they can over the Stalinists. The first and the most committed to fight against the Stalinist apparatus and the Stalinist repression were the Trotskyists in the Soviet Union. So he led the left opposition and then concluded it was absolutely essential and necessary in the 1930s, because of the degeneration of the Comintern and the Communist parties, to launch a struggle to build a new international, as he'd been driven out of what was then the Soviet Union, back into exile, hounded down into Mexico, where the Cardenas regime had given him asylum and allowed him to conduct a political work, from where he developed crucial ideas, analysing for the first time the question of the character of the Stalinist regime, which was a new phenomenon, raising the issue of the need then to build a new international. And within all of that work and more, there are fundamental lessons for us as revolutionaries to draw upon today. And for that reason, the Committee for a Workers' International is moving towards commemorating the life, the sacrifice, the contribution of Leon Trotsky through the publication of a new book which will deal with his ideas. Leon Trotsky, whose ideas couldn't be killed, which will be published shortly. And this Sunday, on August the 23rd, a public rally will be organised, which we'd invite you to attend, where you can hear and develop more about the ideas of the CWI and the tremendous lessons and legacy left by Trotsky himself. So we'd appeal to you to attend our rally on Sunday. You can register to attend if you go to our website, socialistworld.net, which we encourage you to do. And we'd now like to move maybe to explore a few of the ideas that we have in the book that we're going to publish, more of which you'll hear about at the rally on Sunday. And of course, one of the things we'll be marking is the question of the Russian Revolution and Trotsky's role in that. And therefore, maybe we'd like to have a few comments and words on the importance of that from Judy Bushin, who's contributed to the book about Trotsky's role in the Russian Revolution.
One chapter of a book can't easily outline Trotsky, the Russian Revolution, the Civil War, and the building of the young worker state, because Trotsky played a role, an absolutely crucial role, at many stages over those incredible years. And also he did an enormous amount of work in contributing to the events of those years. He had played 12 years before those events a key role in the 1905 revolution, but then was in exile when the events began in 1917, the February Revolution in 1917, but got back to Russia as soon as he could, and was then an absolutely key player, really, in the events that led to the Bolshevik victory in October 1917. It was, in fact, Trotsky who made the detailed plans, was spearheading the detailed plans in Petrograd to remove power from the pro-capitalist provisional government and for that power to then be taken by the Soviet, which was the Council of Workers and Soldiers Deputies, in which the Bolsheviks had by that time won a majority. The Bolsheviks were then able to consolidate their victory by fulfilling their pledges, basically. Lenin very quickly, after the Bolsheviks came to power, announced that Russia's participation in the war would end, that land would be distributed to the peasants' committees, that nations would have the right to self-determination, another very important pledge, and that workers would have control over production, amongst other immediate measures that the Bolsheviks announced. Now, this was really a fantastic achievement, this revolution, the greatest so far in human history, we can say, because it was the first time that a rule by a minority in society had been ended and rule was taken by the majority in society. So as such, it was a tremendous development. But the previous minority didn't accept that situation and moved to take military action against the young workers' state, which then meant a civil war. And again, Trotsky here played an absolutely crucial role, because it was Trotsky who built an army to defend the young workers' state from scratch, the Red Army, which then went on to achieve victory in the Civil War. So this chapter outlines these developments, and again, you know, it can really outlining in extremely brief form here, but the chapter is also obviously only able to really deal with it in quite a short manner, and also ending that period with Trotsky's role in building the new Communist International, because Lenin and Trotsky fully recognized that socialism could not be built in one country alone, and also the productive forces, the development of industry wasn't at a stage in Russia at that time that could provide the prerequisites of socialism, basically answering the needs of everyone, the material needs of everybody in society. So the building of the forces for socialist societies internationally was absolutely crucial. And Trotsky went on to write, in fact, the manifestos of the first 4 congresses of the Communist International. So that's really where this chapter finishes.
Well, thanks, Judy, for those brief comments. And of course, the role of the Revolutionary Party was crucial in terms of the Russian Revolution itself, as it is indeed elsewhere today. And maybe Hannah Sell from the International Secretariat would also like to make some comments on that.
The writings of Leon Trotsky on the issue of a revolutionary party are a really invaluable resource for the new generation who are beginning to think about socialist ideas and how to change the world. In his masterpiece, The History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky sums up a revolution. He describes it as the direct interference of the masses into historical events. And he explains how, at crucial moments, when the old order becomes no longer endurable to the masses, they break the barriers excluding them from the political arena, sweep aside their traditional representatives, and create by their own interference the initial groundwork for a new regime. That is a summary of a revolution, and it's not something that any party can make happen. The class struggle, above all revolutions, have their own dynamic. Nonetheless, a revolutionary party has a crucial role to play, and also in the introduction to A History of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky sums that up. He says it's not an independent, but nevertheless a very important element in the process. Without a guiding organisation, the energy of the masses would dissipate like steam not enclosed in a piston box. But nevertheless, what moves things is not the piston or the box, but the steam. Now, Trotsky wasn't, and we're not, talking about a revolutionary party being something that brings a socialist programme or the ideas necessary to change society from the outside, from above. On the contrary, the Revolutionary Party as a living part of the struggle. To give an example of that, if you take the question of the Soviets, the democratic workers' committees that existed in both Russian revolutions, all three actually, they developed spontaneously in 1905 in the first Russian Revolution. So they didn't come from the Bolshevik Party, from the Revolutionary Party, but it was Lenin and Trotsky who understood the importance of the Soviets and recognised in 1917 the vital role they had to play in leading the struggle for a new society, but also in beginning to build it. Today, we're in a world where capitalism is in crisis, and the working class and poor have shown again and again their willingness to enter the scene of history, to struggle for a new society, and therefore the need to build at least the beginnings, the framework of revolutionary parties, a revolutionary international which is capable of leading the masses in a struggle for socialism that is worthy of them, is more important today than ever, and a brilliant starting point for grasping that, for learning what is necessary, is to go back and read Trotsky's writings on the subject.
Of course, from the Russian Revolution, Trotsky really, his contribution theoretically was around the issue of the theory of the permanent revolution, which is crucial to today's situation as well. And maybe Sinan from the International Secretariat would like to make some comments on that.
One of the most important contribution to Marxism by Trotsky is this idea of permanent revolution. It is the collection of ideas, explain how capitalism developed across the world, and also application of it is so vital in order to take any revolutionary movement towards socialist conclusion. Trotsky defended the scientific tradition of Marxism and developed these ideas. In the law of uneven and combined development, explains in terms of how unevenly developing the capitalism across the world, but also how a revolution can take place in any part of the world, but it doesn't have to go through a particular stage of capitalist development in order for the socialist revolution to take place. And all these ideas in terms of fighting against the stages approach, the classical ideas and so on, where the capitalist bourgeois democratic revolution has to take place before any socialist revolution can develop. But also Trotsky fought back against utopian idea that the socialism can be established within the boundaries of a particular country or a region, etc., or contributed various understanding in terms of the role of the working class, the character of the peasantry, and various these ideas. These are ideas, not just ideas, abstract ideas, but rooted and pushed forward through the objective condition, developed out of objective condition in the revolution of 1905 and 1917. Trotsky leading these revolutions in Russia came to understand, through his experience and knowledge, develop these ideas. And these ideas are so vital even now. Application of it is so important for in any of the movement or a revolutionary process that is taking place across the world, for us to win, to take these processes towards the rightful conclusion in terms of taking power, but also developing it towards the socialist revolution.
Now, of course, the national question was crucial in Russia, and Lenin in particular emphasized without a correct position on the national question, it would not have been possible for the revolution to have triumphed. And Trotsky played an important role also in relation to understanding the national question. So maybe Niall would like to make a few comments on the national question.
Trotsky was acquainted closely with the national question all of his life. He was brought up in Tsarist Russia, which Lenin described as the prison house of nationalities. He lived for a number of years in Vienna, which is in the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he covered the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913 as a journalist. And Trotsky, of course, learnt about the national question from the ideas and the approach of Marx and Engels on areas like Poland and Ireland, and also from the position of Lenin, who Trotsky readily said had the most developed position at that time on the national question, which was a treasure for humanity. Lenin and Trotsky agreed with the position in 1917 that the national minorities and nations should have the right to self-determination. This allowed the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917 to succeed, and the Bolsheviks, once in power, followed through on that principle, and Finland was allowed to leave the Soviet Union in December 1917. But that doesn't mean that Marxists are obliged to support every call for separation. It depends on the circumstances and the needs and the interests of the working class. So, for example, in 1936, Trotsky opposed the Saar referendum for the Saar region to join Germany, because at that time, of course, it would meant handing over the peoples of that region to fascist rule. And Trotsky always had a principled but yet flexible approach on the national question. So, for example, in 1939, he surprised many when he called for Ukrainian independence. The context of this was the fact that the Nazis had made links with reactionary Ukrainian nationalists. The Nazis had been able to gain some support in Ukraine due to the deep hatred of many of the Ukrainian people towards the Stalin regime. Stalinism for them had meant famine, mass deportations, and national oppression. Trotsky's idea of an independent Soviet Ukraine was a way to appeal to the peasants and to cut across the support of the nationalists who were in collaboration with Hitler. The call for an independent Ukrainian worker state was meant to boost the political revolution. And the political revolution is how Trotsky described the movement of workers which would begin to overthrow the Stalinist bureaucracy and bring back workers' rule and workers' power. And Trotsky advocated that after independence, a socialist Ukraine should become part of a genuine socialist federation of the Russia and the region on an equal and voluntary basis. All the things that Stalinism was opposed to. But also in the 1930s, as we indicate in the book, Trotsky made many contributions and comments on important issues of the day. For example, the national question in Spain during the revolutionary period of the 1930s concerning Catalonia and the Basque Country. He also wrote on the question of the oppression of the black population of the United States in the 1930s. He wrote extensively on the question of the special oppression of the Jewish population throughout Europe, who at that time were facing extermination from the Nazi regime. And our book will go into all these issues. But I think also, of course, there's a great relevance today for Trotsky's ideas. In the history of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky has a whole chapter on the national question, and in particular, he looks at the situation of Lenin's principled position on the national question and compares that with the erroneous theory of national cultural autonomy, which was put forward at that time by the Austrian Social Democrats inside the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. This theory advocated separation of workers along the lines of culture, language, and ethnicity. And it was a disaster for the workers' movement at that period in time. Today it has echoes, of course, in the divisive ideas of identity politics and other such ideas in society. So Trotsky and his ideas on the national question are not some sort of blueprint that we take with us today and implement mechanically across the world. The main lessons from Trotsky's approach on the national question and the approach of Lenin, Marx and Engels is that the national question is not set in stone, but is a living process that changes, and therefore it requires careful study by Marxists and a correct application of programme and ideas. We'll go into all of this in more detail in the book, along with other chapters on the ideas of Leon Trotsky, which are still very relevant for today and which can help the workers' movement develop in the next period ahead as we enter into mighty class explosions.
And of course, one of Trotsky's monumental contributions, theoretically, was to analyse the development of the Stalinist regime inside the Soviet Union itself, through his book, particularly In Defence of October and The Revolution Betrayed. And maybe Claire, from the International Secretariat, would like to make some comments on the importance of those ideas.
Trotsky, in his biography of Stalin, actually unfinished because he was murdered while he was writing it, explains how this insignificant Bolshevik from Georgia became one of the most powerful dictators in world history, really, who was responsible for the deaths of millions through forced collectivization, through the mass murders, the purge trials, and even in the war, the incompetence in the Second World War, which meant the deaths of millions. But he represented a Thermidorian, as Trotsky described it, reaction after the revolution, which didn't spread to other countries to enable a healthy development of socialism. Stalin oversaw this kind of this dictatorship which pushed aside the real revolutionaries in the way that the Jacobins were pushed aside at the time of the French Revolution. But it was a dictatorship that did not change the class nature of society in the way that the class nature of France was maintained even after this pushing aside of the Jacobins. And that's what's so important about what Trotsky explains, especially in a brilliant book called Revolution Betrayed. Of course, Stalin was the betrayer, but he had a whole clique around him who grew fat, grew very privileged on the basis of the state-owned planned economy, but there was no longer any workers' democracy or any control over that society. For a while, that the planned economy, because there was state ownership and planning, it actually advanced far more rapidly than any capitalist country, even the US or Britain at the time, in the period leading up to the Second World War. And even afterwards, it slowed down, but it kept going. And you'll probably have to cut this little bit because I'm not keeping going. It kept going. But as in Revolution Betrayed, Trotsky describes the nature of the bureaucracy, the zigzags, the calamities, but he also puts forward a brilliant prognosis that either there would be a political revolution when workers would take back control over the state-owned planned economy, or there would actually be a social counter-revolution, and the bureaucracy would become a capitalist class. And we saw that as the economy slowed down really in the 80s and then in the 90s. And by 1991, when Yeltsin actually stood on a tank after the collapse of an attempted coup, you had the driving through of the wholesale privatization of the economy, mass shock therapy it was called, and it led to the collapse of the economy by 50%. It led to mass poverty, privatization, but that was carried through by a handful of party bureaucrats who used their position to literally rob the working class. And well, they even used gangster tactics, and there were a few shootouts, but eventually there was a handful of oligarchs that actually ran a capitalist society, and capitalism was restored. It's a tragedy that the workers were not strong enough, were not able to retake control over the state-owned planned economy, and then spread the idea of socialism internationally. But that is our task, and because we understand what Stalinism was and what it wasn't. It wasn't communism and socialism. We understand that the way it collapsed means that the ideas of socialism and communism are genuinely the most valid for today's society, and on the basis of huge developments of the economy since the time of Stalin's ascent to power, if you like, that we could really have the spread of socialism internationally, and we could live in a different world. Not long from now, because as we've seen with the epidemic, there are huge crises in society and huge movements, and the leadership will learn nothing from Stalinism Stalinism or Stalinists, and everything from those who can explain what Stalinism was and why it collapsed.
And also, of course, Trotsky concluded in 1938 the importance of building a new international organization, a Trotskys Revolutionary International Organization, which the CWI has continued in that work in the recent period. And maybe Bob would like to make some comments on that.
From the very beginning of the socialist movement, it has been international. And Trotsky is remembered as a determined fighter precisely for international socialism. And that was the record of his entire life. From the very beginning of his activity, he saw himself, like other socialists in Russia and around the world, as part of an international movement. And they saw that capitalism had made the world into one huge market. And therefore the struggle, both to achieve higher living standards, but also fundamentally to end the capitalist system, was also, while it started in different nations, was also an international struggle. And this was a hallmark of Trotsky's life. He saw that from the beginning of his activity. He saw that also in a link between the revolution in Russia and the revolutions outside Russia. And his idea, that idea of the international link, came into vision, came into practice during the First World War and in the Russian Revolution itself, where, to use Lenin's phrase, capitalism broke at its weakest link in Russia in 1917. But both Trotsky, Lenin, and the leaders of the Russian Revolution saw their movement as the first stage of an international revolution. And certainly immediately after the Russian Revolution, there was a wave of similar movements, revolutions in Europe and also outside Europe. But unfortunately, those revolutions did not result in the spreading of the socialist revolution. They were not victorious. And in that situation, we had the isolation of Russia. And in that situation of the isolation of the Russian Revolution and the growth of Stalinism, Trotsky became a fighter against the Stalinist idea of so-called socialism in one country, and also the fighting to defend the idea of building an international movement against capitalism, but also against the reaction against fascism and against war. And this was a hallmark of Trotsky's activities in the 1920s and in the 1930s. And in the 1930s, after the victory of Hitler in Germany in 1933, Trotsky devoted his attentions not simply to fighting for a program, a socialist program which is necessary to defeat capitalism, but also for building the organizations, nationally and internationally, which could actually achieve that program, which could actually win support for that program in the workers' movement. And so in the final part of his life, Trotsky's work was centered around the idea of building a new international. There had been previous international organizations of workers, some which had been defeated by defeats in the movement, like the First International. The Second International crumbled when most of its leaders supported their own sides in the First World War. And the Third International, which was established after the Russian Revolution, that steadily degenerated politically and organizationally. Politically, it became an agency of the Stalinist clique, which had come to power in the Soviet Union. And organizationally, it became a completely undemocratic organization. And in light of that, Trotsky's struggle from 1933 onwards for a new international, for an international which would link together socialist fighters around the world in a common battle, both against oppression and also against capitalism, became a key part of his life. And that is something that we try to explain in the book that we've published, how Trotsky tried to lay down the political foundation for a new international, the political foundation for the parties which are necessary if we're going to achieve the overthrow of capitalism. And also how those parties, how that international began to try to intervene in the movements which took place, laying the basis for what we're attempting to do now in a far more unstable world situation where we have the COVID crisis at the present time. We have mass unemployment developing in country after country around the world, and all the issues and the massive problems which exist in the countries of Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. In this stormy world situation, where we don't just have economic crisis, but also the threat of climate change, the question of internationalism, the question of the program which Trotsky fought for all his life is as important as it ever was. And it's on that basis that we're trying to build the means to change the world and liberate humanity.
And just to underline the fact that we're also including in the book some other chapters as well, one on the trade union question by Philip Stott from Scotland, one on fascism by Sasha Sanicic from Germany, and an important contribution on one of Trotsky's crucial additions, and that is the question of the transitional program and its method and the application of that today. And we're publishing a very extensive work by Peter Taff, which will be included in the book, which is extremely relevant to today's situation of the method of Trotsky and how it's applied in today's situation. So I'd like to thank you for watching this broadcast. We'd appeal for you once again to join us at the rally, which has been publicised. It's on August the 23rd, that's a Sunday, at 2 o'clock. British Standard Time. You can go on to socialistworld.net to register to attend. We published our list of speakers, but we'll now also be joined to that. We're very pleased to announce that Peter Taff, the political secretary of the Socialist Party in England and Wales and a member of the International Secretariat of the CWI, will now also be speaking at that, which would be a big plus. So we'd like to invite all of our viewers to join us in the rally on Sunday. In the meantime, stay safe, don't be passive, get active, join the CWI and join us in the struggle for a socialist world.